Hello, and welcome back to Speak English Daily.
Hi, everyone. We are very happy to see you here today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Speak English Daily. I'm Anna.
And I'm Mike. It's great to have you here again. Today, we're talking about something that almost everyone struggles with: difficult conversations.
Yeah, and let me start with a simple question. Have you ever avoided a difficult conversation?
I think most people will say yes. I've definitely done that many times.
Same here. Maybe you wanted to tell a coworker something or talk to a friend about a problem, but you just didn't.
Or you kept thinking about it, right? You replay the conversation in your head, but you never actually say anything in real life.
Exactly. And sometimes the longer you wait, the harder it becomes.
That's true. It builds up. You start with a small issue, but because you don't talk about it, it becomes bigger and more stressful.
And this doesn't only happen at work. It happens in friendships, relationships, even with family.
Yeah, like telling a friend they hurt your feelings, or saying no to someone when you don't want to do something.
Or giving feedback at work. That's a big one.
Definitely. So today, we're going to help you talk about these situations in English, not in a textbook way, but in a natural, real-life way.
And we'll also explain some useful words and phrases as we go, so you can understand not just what to say, but how to say it comfortably.
Because here's the thing. Difficult conversations are not just about vocabulary. They're about tone, emotion, and confidence.
Right. You might know the words, but still feel nervous using them.
So think of this episode as a safe space to practice.
And maybe, after listening, you'll feel a little more ready to have that conversation you've been avoiding.
All right, let's start with a simple idea. What do we actually mean when we say a difficult conversation?
Good question. A difficult conversation is any conversation that feels uncomfortable, stressful, or emotionally challenging.
For example, telling someone they made a mistake. That can feel difficult.
Or saying no. Even a simple no can be hard, especially if you don't want to disappoint the other person.
Another example is expressing your feelings, like saying, "I felt hurt when you said that."
That's a great example. And notice the phrase, "I felt hurt." That's a very natural way to express emotion in English.
Yeah, instead of blaming the other person, you focus on your own feeling.
Exactly. And that connects to another important idea, being honest but polite.
That's a really useful phrase. Honest but polite means you tell the truth, but in a respectful and careful way.
So you're not aggressive and you're not rude, but you're also not hiding your thoughts.
Right, you're finding a balance.
Another word you might hear in this context is confront.
Yeah, that's a strong word. When we say confront someone, we mean to face a problem directly, usually by talking to the person about it.
And sometimes people feel nervous about that word because it can sound a bit intense.
It can. It doesn't always mean fighting, but it does mean you're not avoiding the issue anymore.
Which brings us to another important word, avoid.
If you avoid something, you try not to deal with it. You stay away from it.
So if you avoid a difficult conversation, you choose not to have it, even if you know you probably should.
And most people do this at some point.
Definitely. And the reason is simple. These conversations feel uncomfortable.
That's another key word. Uncomfortable means you don't feel relaxed or at ease. You might feel nervous, awkward, or stressed.
For example, you might say, "I feel uncomfortable talking about this."
That's a very natural sentence and very useful.
So when we put it all together, a difficult conversation is one where you feel uncomfortable, but you need to be honest, polite, and maybe even confront a problem.
And that's not easy.
Not at all.
So now the big question is, why do people avoid these conversations so often?
Yeah, because even when we know it's important, we still don't do it.
One big reason is fear of conflict.
Conflict means disagreement or argument. So when people say, "I don't want to make things awkward," they mean they don't want to argue or fight.
Exactly. They want things to stay peaceful even if there's a problem.
And that leads to a very common sentence. I don't want to make things awkward.
That's such a natural phrase. Awkward means uncomfortable in a social way, like when something feels strange or tense between people.
For example, if you tell your friend something difficult, you might worry the relationship will feel awkward afterward.
So instead of speaking, you stay silent.
Which leads to another common thought. I'd rather stay quiet.
Yeah, that's a very honest sentence. It means you prefer not to say anything, even if something is bothering you.
And sometimes people don't stay quiet because they want to. They stay quiet because they don't know how to speak.
Exactly. And that's where this sentence comes in. I'm not sure how to say this.
That's a powerful phrase. It shows honesty and hesitation at the same time.
And actually, that sentence itself can be a great way to start a difficult conversation.
That's true. You're being open about your difficulty.
Another reason people avoid these conversations is fear of hurting others.
Yeah, you might think, if I say this, I'll make them feel bad.
Or they'll be upset with me.
Especially if you care about the person.
Right. It's much harder to have a difficult conversation with someone you like or respect.
Because you don't want to damage the relationship.
And then there's another fear of consequences.
That's a big one. Consequences means the results of your actions.
For example, if you speak honestly at work, maybe you worry it could affect your job.
Or if you say no to someone, maybe they think you won't like you anymore.
So you start thinking too much.
And the more you think, the more you avoid.
Exactly.
So, to summarize what we've talked about so far, people avoid difficult conversations because they feel uncomfortable, they fear conflict, they don't want to hurt others, and they're unsure about the outcome.
And also because they don't always have the language to express themselves clearly.
Which is what we're working on today.
Yeah, step by step.
And here's something important to remember. Avoiding a conversation might feel easier in the short term,
but in the long term, it often creates more stress.
Exactly.
So, learning how to handle these conversations is not just about English. It's about improving your real-life communication.
And that's what makes this topic so valuable.
All right, in the next part, we're going to look at a real-life situation at work and see how these conversations actually happen.
And we'll show you both a bad example and a better way to say the same thing.
That's where things get really practical.
All right, let's make this practical. Imagine a real situation. Mike, you said earlier that giving feedback at work can be difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Let's say I have a coworker who is always late with their tasks, and it starts affecting my work.
That's a very common situation. So first, let's show a bad example. What might someone say if they are too direct or not careful with their words?
Okay, maybe something like, "You're always late with your work. This is really unprofessional."
Yeah, that sounds very direct.
Too direct.
Exactly. And when you say you're always late, it sounds like you're blaming the person.
Right, and words like always can make the other person feel attacked.
Also, saying this is really unprofessional sounds like a judgment.
Which can make the other person defensive.
Defensive means they start protecting themselves instead of listening to you.
So instead of solving the problem, you create more tension.
Now, let's look at another bad example, but in a different way. This time, too vague.
Okay, maybe I say, "Hey, everything is fine, but maybe just try to be a bit more careful."
That sounds polite, but what's the problem?
It's not clear.
Exactly. The other person might not even understand what you're talking about.
So nothing changes.
Right. So we don't want to be too direct, and we don't want to be too vague. We need something in the middle.
Let's try a better version.
Go for it.
Hey, I've noticed that some tasks have been coming in a bit late, and it's been affecting my schedule. I feel like we could improve this if we coordinate a bit more.
That's much better. Let's break that down a little.
Sure.
First, you said, "I've noticed that." That's a very useful phrase.
Yeah, it sounds less aggressive. You're just describing what you see.
Exactly. You're not attacking the person, you're talking about the situation.
Then I said, it's been affecting my schedule.
That's important because you're explaining the impact.
Right, I'm showing why it matters.
And then you used, I feel like we could improve this.
That's softening language.
Yes. When you say, I feel like, it makes your statement sound more personal and less like a command.
And we could sounds cooperative.
Exactly. You're working together, not blaming.
Another phrase that works well is, maybe we could.
Yes. For example, maybe we could set clearer deadlines.
That sounds like a suggestion, not an order.
And that's the key idea here. You want to reduce tension, not increase it.
So to summarize this situation, instead of saying, you're always late, you can say, I've noticed some delays.
And instead of blaming, you focus on solutions.
Exactly.
All right, now let's move to a more personal situation. This one is a bit more emotional.
Yeah, because work conversations are one thing, but personal conversations can feel even harder.
Definitely. So imagine this. I have a friend, and recently they said something that really upset me.
Okay, so what would a bad example sound like here?
Maybe something like, what you said was really rude. I didn't like it.
That sounds honest, but also a bit harsh.
Yeah, it can make the other person feel attacked.
And again, they might become defensive.
Exactly. Or another bad example is saying nothing at all.
Just staying quiet,
Yeah, and pretending everything is fine, even when it's not.
which can damage the relationship over time.
So let's try a better way.
Go ahead.
Hey, I wanted to talk about something. I felt hurt when you said that the other day.
That sounds much calmer.
And more personal.
Let's look at that phrase. I felt hurt when...
This is a very important structure. You're expressing your feeling, not accusing the other person.
You're not saying, you hurt me. You're saying, I felt hurt.
Exactly. It changes the tone completely.
It feels less aggressive and more open.
And then you can continue, for example, I'm not sure if you meant it that way, but it really affected me.
That's good, because you're giving the other person a chance to explain.
Right, you're not assuming their intention.
Another useful phrase is, I didn't mean to upset you, but...
Yes, that's helpful when you think your words might also be sensitive.
It shows that you care about the other person's feelings, too.
Exactly, and that's very important in personal conversations.
So tone becomes very important here.
Definitely. Tone means the way your voice sounds and the feeling behind your words.
You can say the same sentence in a calm tone or an angry tone, and it will feel completely different.
For example, I felt hurt when you said that can sound gentle.
Or it can sound angry, depending on how you say it.
So it's not just about the words, it's also about how you deliver them.
That's a big part of communication.
Another thing to remember is to give space for the other person to respond.
Yeah, don't just speak and then stop the conversation.
Exactly. You might say, can you tell me what you meant?
That invites dialogue,
And it shows you're willing to listen, not just speak.
which makes the conversation more balanced.
So in this situation, instead of blaming your friend, you express your feeling, stay calm, and invite a response.
And that increases the chance of understanding each other.
Exactly.
So, both in work situations and personal situations, the key idea is the same.
Be clear, but be careful with your words.
Use softening language.
And focus on feelings and solutions, not blame.
That's what makes a difficult conversation more productive.
In the next part, we're going to bring everything together and give you some simple strategies you can actually use in real life.
Yeah, this is where it all becomes practical. Not just examples, but tools you can remember when you're in that moment.
Because in real life, you don't have time to think too much. You just need a few clear ideas in your mind.
Exactly. So let's start with the first one, staying calm.
This sounds simple, but it's not always easy.
Not at all. When you're in a difficult conversation, your emotions can rise very quickly.
You might feel angry, nervous, or even frustrated.
And when that happens, your words can become stronger than you intend,
That's a great point. Stronger than you intend means you say something more direct or more emotional than you planned.
which can make the situation worse.
So staying calm means you slow down, you control your tone.
And sometimes it's okay to pause.
Yes, you can take a moment and say, "Let me think about how to say this."
That's a very natural sentence, and it actually helps reduce pressure.
Because you're giving yourself time instead of reacting immediately.
So calm doesn't mean silent, it means controlled.
Exactly. The second strategy is being clear.
This is where many people struggle. They either say too much or not enough.
Right. Being clear means you express your point in a simple and direct way without being aggressive.
For example, instead of saying, "Everything is kind of confusing sometimes," you can say, "I'm having trouble understanding the deadlines."
That's much clearer. And clarity helps the other person understand you better.
Which is important because if they don't understand you, they can't respond properly.
Exactly. And this connects to a very useful phrase. "I'd like to be honest with you."
That's a great way to start a difficult conversation.
It prepares the other person. It tells them something important is coming.
And it also shows that you're trying to be open, not negative.
Right. It sets the tone in a respectful way.
Another simple way to begin is, "Can we talk about something?"
That's one of the most natural phrases in English.
And it's very useful because it gives the other person a moment to prepare,
You're not just starting suddenly, you're inviting them into the conversation.
which makes it feel more balanced.
Now, let's move to the third strategy, listening actively.
This is a big one. A lot of people think communication is only about speaking.
But listening is just as important, maybe even more.
Listening actively means you're not just hearing the words, you're trying to understand the meaning and the feeling behind them.
Exactly. You're focused, you're present, and you're not just waiting for your turn to speak.
That's key. Many people listen only to reply, not to understand.
And when you do that, the conversation becomes one-sided.
So instead, you can show that you're listening by saying things like, "I see what you mean," or "That makes sense."
Those small phrases make a big difference.
They show respect and attention.
And if something is not clear, you can ask, "Can you explain that a bit more?"
That's a great question because it keeps the conversation open.
It also shows that you're interested, not defensive.
Exactly. Now let's talk about another important strategy. Don't accuse.
This is where many conversations go wrong.
When you accuse someone, you say things like, "You always do this," or "You never listen."
Those kinds of sentences sound like attacks.
And when people feel attacked, they stop listening.
They start defending themselves instead.
So instead of accusing, you focus on your own experience.
Like we said earlier, using phrases like, "I feel," or "I've noticed."
For example, instead of saying, "You never help me," you can say, "I feel overwhelmed when I handle everything alone."
That's a big difference. You're still expressing the problem, but in a calmer and more constructive way.
And that leads to better results.
Another helpful expression here is, "Let's figure this out together."
I like that one. It sounds very cooperative.
Yes, it shows that you're not against the other person, you're working with them.
It turns the conversation into a shared problem, not a personal conflict.
Exactly. So if we bring these ideas together, you stay calm, you speak clearly, you listen carefully, and you avoid blaming.
And you use simple, natural phrases to guide the conversation.
That's really all you need.
It might not feel easy at first, but with practice, it becomes more natural.
And remember, you don't need perfect English to have a good conversation.
That's so important.
What matters more is your intention and your tone. If you're respectful and clear, people will understand you, even if your grammar isn't perfect.
Exactly. So now, before we finish today's episode, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've talked about today.
Yeah, let's bring it all together in a simple way.
We started with a simple idea. Difficult conversations are part of life.
And most people avoid them because they feel uncomfortable.
But avoiding them doesn't solve the problem.
It usually makes things more complicated over time.
Then we talked about what makes a conversation difficult.
Things like giving feedback, saying no, or expressing your feelings.
And we introduced some key words and phrases to help you talk about these situations,
Then we looked at real-life examples,
both at work and in personal life.
and we saw how small changes in language can make a big difference.
Exactly. The difference between sounding aggressive and sounding respectful.
And finally, we gave you simple strategies you can actually use.
Stay calm,
Stay clear,
listen actively.
and don't accuse.
If you remember these ideas, you already have a strong foundation.
And here's something we really want you to take with you.
You don't need to start with a big, difficult conversation.
Start small, maybe something simple like saying no politely.
Or expressing a small opinion,
And as you get more comfortable, you can handle bigger conversations.
step by step.
Because confidence doesn't come from knowing everything.
It comes from practice.
Exactly.
So next time you feel nervous about speaking, remember that it's normal.
Everyone feels that way sometimes.
The important thing is to try.
And to keep improving.
All right, that's all for today's episode.
We hope this helped you feel more confident about handling difficult conversations in English.
And in real life, too.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.